Good evening. I'm Jack Casarda, Director of the Frank Hawkins Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of everyone at the Kenan Institute and the Kenan-Flagler Business School, as well as UNC's Department of Public Policy, our university co-sponsors for this evening's event. We're delighted to have you all with us for what I promise you will be an engaging and timely discussion on the future of our nation's fiscal health and policy. You see there are differences. Public policy is often viewed as a difference of perspectives and values and principles and beliefs and ideology, and we are going to have a variety of perspectives and hard questions asked on this, and we have an outstanding panel to present those views on fiscal health and policy. Our co-host, the Concord Coalition, has assembled this panel, very, very impressive set of policy experts to share their knowledge and insights on the daunting topic. The title here is basically Fixing Our Nation's Fiscal Future. This is a very important issue for the UNC community for many reasons, but perhaps most importantly because of our students. Their futures, of course, will be deeply affected by the decisions our nation makes on this issue at present. You can read more about our panelists in your program. The detailed biographies are there. Let me just briefly introduce them. Dr. Alice Rivlin actually holds an honorary degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, so we claim her as one of our own. Alice, we're delighted to have you back in Chapel Hill. Congressman Alex McMillan is a UNC history alumnus. So, Alex, we welcome you home as well.
Thank you very much.
Joining us from the professional staff of the Concord Coalition are, to my immediate left, Robert Bixby, the Executive Director, and at the far end of the table, Stefan Byrd-Krueger, Coordinator of Youth Outreach. Welcome to you both. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to invite Bob Bixby to lead our discussion. Bob?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Jack. I want to thank UNC and thank the Kenan Institute and Jack for being such a great host and doing such a great poster with our pictures on them and everything. It's really terrific. I'm going to begin by, I hope not spoiling this terribly nice day that we're having today with some overview of the federal budget, sort of a federal budget 101, to get you into the mood, so to speak, and lay the groundwork for what the discussion to come will be. Let me see if I can, it works. So I'm always relieved. So first we'll start off with where we are today. This is a freeze frame of the federal budget that is projected, the final figures for 2010, which is the fiscal year that we're in now. These obviously are going to change, already have changed somewhat since these projections were made in January. But it gives you an idea of where the money is in the federal budget and where the revenues come from to pay for it, and the rather large gap that we've got in between right now. One thing I'd want to point out here is the top line on the spending column, and that is the interest. That is the interest payment that we pay on the national debt. Like anybody else, the federal government, when it borrows money, has to pay interest on that. And it's a substantial amount of money, $207 billion. To give you some perspective on that, that is a lot more than we're going to be spending this year on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So an immediate response to, do deficits matter is that, well, yes, they certainly have a budgetary impact, and it's actually quite large, and we'll talk about this more. It'll actually be getting larger, so it's something to keep in mind. One thing economists like to do, and I'm not an economist, but I do play one on television. I'm a lawyer, actually. So I have something to apologize for. The economists like to view the budget in terms of its percentage on the economy, percentage of GDP, gross domestic product. It's actually a better way of looking at it than looking at the number of figures alone, because it puts it in some sort of context. So if you look at spending and revenues and debt as a percentage of our national income, it's giving you a better measure of what we can afford. What's important about this slide, which is admittedly one that only an economist would love, but if you get to understand this, it tells you a lot about where things are and where things are going. We tend to spend around 21% or so of GDP. That's federal spending. And revenues tend to lag around a little over 18%. That's just going back over the last 30 years or so. So we do tend to run budget deficits during that time. The lines cross. You can see they're actually right now almost off the charts because of the recession and bailouts, and revenues have plunged, spending has gone up in response to the short-term economic problems. But the significant thing, and what has many of us budget analysts alarmed, is that the lines do not come anywhere close back together again once you assume that these temporary factors fade away. Budget deficits are often caused by things like recession and war. We have both of those factors at play now. But the really significant thing is when you assume that the recession fades and we're back to a strong economy and the war spending subsides, we still don't get those revenue and spending lines anywhere close, and actually there's a fairly sizable deficit remaining, higher than has been the pattern in the past. So let me just, that one was so bad it didn't want to stay on the screen. So when you run budget deficits, you're obviously, a budget deficit is the annual shortfall. The cumulative deficits add up to the national debt. And that, too, is often measured as a percentage of the economy. You can see it was rather high at the end of World War II, steadily came down, rose a bit, and is going back up again now. This year probably topping 60% of GDP, which is far higher than it's normally been. And the last time we were there was in the early 1950s, when we were on our way back down from the high debt of World War II. And again, the more significant point is the trajectory. If we're on a path to keep running large budget deficits, the debt will continue to rise as a percentage of the economy. Nobody thinks it's going to get as high as it would appear in that slide, but you have to look at where you're going. In order to avoid that happening, we're going to have to make some very hard choices, but that basically tells you we're on an unsustainable path. A couple of consequences of large borrowing. One of them has come up a lot in recent years, which is the percentage of our debt held by foreign investors has gone up sharply. Americans haven't been saving very much, and we've been running big budget deficits, and so a lot of the money that we're borrowing to finance our debt is coming from abroad. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does create a certain vulnerability for our economy if we're increasingly dependent upon the kindness of strangers, you might say. And also, the investment that they make in this country will flow to their benefit, so it acts as a mortgage on our future national income, because more of it will have to be used, more of our future national income, to service this debt that's been, these amounts that have been lent to us to finance our deficits. Another consequence of big deficits is interest costs. I mentioned that before. But this shows you that the $200 billion that I talked about that we're paying now, if we continue to run budget deficits at the rate that are projected, interest cost will continue to rise very rapidly, and so even by the end of the next 10 years would top $800 billion. To give you some perspective, that would be more than we were paying for all of national defense. So it would become a very large part of the federal budget that, again, is an expense to taxpayers, and ultimately is also on an unsustainable track. One of the things that you look at when the federal budget is the three largest programs are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I'll say a little bit more about that. But they're projected to grow at such a rate with the deficits and with the interest costs that you don't have to look out very far, just around 15 years. And those three programs plus net interest would consume just about everything we project to come in revenue. So anything else the government wanted to do would have to be borrowed. Again, I don't think that's going to happen, but it shows you a dangerous trend that we need to address. So why is all this happening? Well, one of them factors, one of the dynamics at play is an aging of the population. Over the next 20 years or so, the percentage of the population age 65 and over is going to grow from around 13% today to around 20%. And that alone will have an impact on programs like Social Security and Medicare, just the demographics. But it's not demographics alone that we have to worry about. It's also rising health care costs, which affects primarily Medicare and Medicaid when you're looking at the federal budget. Health care costs have been rising faster than the economy. We've certainly heard a lot about that in the past year. This has been a trend that goes back many decades. And if you just project forward and say, well, what happens if we don't do something to slow the rate of growth of health care costs? You can see you know, Medicare and Medicaid would eventually consume within about 30, 40 years as much of the economy as the entire federal budget does today. So controlling health care costs really, really is a central challenge for the future in order to get off these unsustainable trends. We get a lot of questions about why focus on Social Security, Medicare, because those are very popular, very important programs. Can't we solve the problem by cutting defense? Well, that should be part of the solution, but it's important to remember that defense doesn't necessarily grow faster. It's not on autopilot like Social Security and Medicare are. It's not affected by the demographics. So when people do projections, it actually looks like defense may come down as a percentage of the economy when you look out into the future, whereas the other programs are growing rather rapidly. Again, Medicare costs are a big part of that. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, but it's important when you're thinking about Social Security and Medicare to realize that they are on autopilot, and so Congress doesn't go through and review every year what to spend on them. They just go by demographics on Social Security, demographics and health care costs on Medicare. So even when we look at say like trust fund balances for Social Security, you look at Medicare trust funds, it's important to remember that the federal government is going to have to come up with the cash to make good on the bonds that are accumulating in the trust fund. So when you look at the impact on the budget, it's going to be quite severe, and the problem begins much sooner than would appear if you were just going to look at trust fund balances alone. So you put it all together, and we're on a very unsustainable track. The yellow line going through the middle shows the average revenues. If we tried to keep revenues about where they are today, well, not where they are today, because they're unusually low today, but if they're historic average, and you let everything else grow as it's projected to grow, you see there's our friend net interest again, really, really ballooning towards the end because of the huge budget deficits that we're going to run. I'll skip over why deficits matter because we're trying to keep to a time thing here, and we can talk about the Q&A, but talk about these things in the Q&A. But let me just end on a few points of agreement that seem to be shared by folks on the left or right. It's not a matter of ideology, really. It's a matter of arithmetic. The current fiscal policies that we have are unsustainable. And there aren't any easy solutions like cutting waste, fraud, and abuse or growing the economy. We should do both of those things, but those things alone won't be enough. So we're going to have to look at some very hard choices on the policy side. That's going to require bipartisan cooperation and a willingness to negotiate on these things without setting preconditions. Public engagement, we believe, is very, very important to this. That's why we're here today, and that's why we've been doing events like this all over the country for the past few years, because it's important for the public to be part of this discussion on very, very important issues. And finally, even though we talk a lot about numbers and have a lot of numbers, ultimately it's not a numbers issue. This isn't a green eye shade sort of a thing. It's really a moral issue. It's about the legacy that our generation, my generation, is leaving to future generations. And right now, that legacy doesn't look so good. And if we're leaving an unsustainable path, and just in 15 to 20 years, to most of the people in this audience, if you're 20 years old today, by the time you're my age, what we're telling you is that the economy is going to be off the track and an unsustainable trend. So the younger people have the most at stake, and that's why it's not just a numbers issue and why everybody needs to be involved. So for some perspective on the past and the solutions and going forward, I'll turn now to Congressman Alex McMillan. Alex?
I'm not there anymore, thank goodness. But this is where the buck stops, because unless Congress does something, then nothing will happen. Or unless the president does something, nothing will happen. I'll put it even stronger. I'm going to put this over. Okay. Thank you all very much for coming and showing your concern for what is really a crucial issue. And Bob didn't put numbers on it. I'd like to mention a few that describe it the way I look at it. With the annual deficits, this year's going to be possibly at least $1.4 trillion, maybe $2 trillion. That's still a moving target. External debt of $12 trillion at the end of the year, probably. That's another moving target. And Congressional Budget Office estimates we'll be adding to that at $1 trillion per year over the next 10 years. So you're talking about $22 trillion indebtedness at the end of the decade. But that doesn't include what we call the unfunded liabilities of the entitlement funds, Social Security, Medicare, and you could throw in there private pension guarantee corp. If a corporation had to account for those, the figures would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $86 trillion of unfunded liabilities that we've contracted for in payments, entitlement payments for Social Security and Medicare alone. And something's going to have to be addressed on that. It's not remotely sustainable. I thought it was a major problem when I left business in 1983 to serve in Congress, mainly out of concern then that the 1983 deficit was $207 billion, and external debt of the United States then was $1.137 trillion, one-third of what it is today. When I left Congress, when I left in '94, the deficit was $203 billion, not much change, and the external debt was $3.4 trillion, more or less. It had not varied widely off that track, despite tax cuts and increases, spending bulges and restraint advocated variously by Reagan, Bush 1, and Clinton. When I left Congress in 1995, I contributed $10,000 of my unspent campaign funds, because I was concerned about it, to the Concord Coalition to establish what was called Facing Facts, which is still in existence. The fax is maybe somewhat outmoded. They still use it, but it sends out, what are we doing, a monthly summary of conditions, and it largely is sent to members of the Senate, members of the House, members of the Cabinet, and to editors around the country and some prominent writers. And I would say the board and staff of the Concord Coalition in the bipartisan world, a non-political world supposedly, has some of the best reputation of anybody. So you'll often see Bob Bixby on the media when they don't know what to say. And they find Bob to set them straight, and he does a great job with it. So does the rest of the staff. I believe strongly in Congress in a bipartisan solution to this problem as well as other problems. But this current challenge is so major and so explosive that it will only succeed if, in my judgment, this president harnesses himself to a recommended path and seeks to accomplish a positive result on process within this fiscal year. Because I think after another election, the opportunity will pass for another 4 years. I did not agree with the lack of bipartisanship as I perceived it in the process on health care reform, but it got done. You got to give the president credit for that. But I believe it could have been done, and indeed might yet be done, with bipartisan solutions that would put a better taste in everyone's mouth and maybe even afford a few ideas that didn't get considered. I know a little something about that because I worked on the last health care reform in '93. I was one of 5 Republicans that worked on a health care task force that basically met with the designer of that health care plan, which isn't that different from this one, about once every 2 weeks at 7 o'clock in the morning. His name was Ira Magazina, and we sought to accommodate to that plan. But in the final analysis, they didn't listen to our ideas any more than I think they listened to other ideas this time. By nature and experience, I'm conservative financially, but innovative in terms of business or government issues. I don't consider those two things to be in conflict, ideologically or practically. And therefore, I think the solution lies somewhere in between. In the 1980s and 90s, there was a political center in Congress. I call it a financial political center. It doesn't seem to exist much anymore, but I would say it could be engaged and it could influence the outcome for a period of at least 10 years and perhaps a little bit longer. That was willing to stand up and be counted on fiscal matters. There were Democrats and Republicans both in that category. I went to Congress for 10 years. I was never a part of a majority in the whole time, but I was able to be effective by supporting coalitions with good ideas and commitment. And I hope that's not something of the past. It's not a matter of ideologically posturing. It's a matter of practical results for what's good for the country, in my judgment. I want to give you 2 examples of one that worked and one that really didn't, that I happen to be a part of. Reagan and Bush had pretty much successfully reduced taxes during a period of 12 years and supported defense initiatives and reinforced an innovative growing business climate. So we had a pretty good growth base during those years. But the missing link was the fact that they didn't exercise fiscal restraint, or couldn't. The Congress wouldn't go along with it, and they didn't necessarily propose it. So the deficits continued. We didn't grow our way out of a deficit, as was advertised. Accordingly, the deficit wobbled, I would say, from 150 billion to 200 billion up through the first Gulf War in 1990, which kind of bulged it up by some proportions. In 1990, we had a piece of legislation, a deficit reduction device called Graham-Rudman, and later Graham-Rudman-Hollings, and that was expiring. It had been fairly effective, but it had some holes in it. But the House Republicans then, a minority, mind you, led by a guy named Bill Frenzel, who still works with the Brookings Institute, and Democrats, to persuade the administration to go along with what was called the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990. George Bush was the president, Bush 1, I should say. It revised law with 2 important budget control processes. A set of caps on discretionary spending. Now that's all but, basically to simplify it, all but the entitlement programs, which as you've seen are increasingly a dominating part of the total budget. But they annually appropriated spending, that was one thing, putting caps on it, setting targets. And the other was a pay-go process. You've heard pay-go maybe even mentioned some in the recent debate. Pay-go basically oversimplified means that you don't spend anything without the money in hand or prospectively to pay for it in the current budget year. That can either be through cutting some other expenses or raising taxes or, unfortunately, increasing the debt, which is usually the opt-out. But it set up targets that had to be met. And if you didn't meet those targets, we had something called sequestration, which could then reduce the spending levels automatically without action by Congress. And it was the respected law basically from 1990 over a 5-year period, which it was established in law till 95. Bush 1 probably lost his 92 re-election. I know there were other factors, in part because he broke his no new tax pledge. Remember, read my lips, no new taxes. As a negotiating tool, he was persuaded to give up a moderate tax increase, most of which was tobacco excise tax, and even the tobacco companies didn't oppose it, and a tax on yachts to fund, I think, the Coast Guard to some degree for the service they provided. But he probably lost an election over what turned out, in my judgment, to be one of the most significant budget moves of the 80s and 90s. And it didn't end then. I wasn't on the budget committee at the time, but I volunteered to support Frunzel in that debate of 1990 on the floor. And what began with solid bipartisan support initially for it unraveled once the no new tax issue came up on the table. So some of my wobbly Republican colleagues bailed out because there was a tax increase in it without even looking at what the nature of the tax was. It was insignificant, basically. Nevertheless, the coalition held together and passed that with probably 55 Republicans finally voting for it, me being one of them. And I never took a no new tax pledge. Nobody threw me out of office. I believe the 90 Act set a precedent, which was confirmed by another budget act of 1997, extending pay-go for another 5 more years into the 2002. The two ultimately brought the budget into surplus from 1998 to 2001, 4 years of surpluses. And Erskine Bowles had a lot to do with it. Ms. Rivlin had a lot to do with it. You got to give the president credit for sticking with it. And you had a bipartisan group that the Republicans were then controlling the House. And they went along with it this time. Even Newt Gingrich did. He was negotiating for the Republican majority. Possibly your other co-chairmen were involved in that, Senators Simpson and Domenici. That was a great example of a bipartisan coalition in the Congress, in the Senate, in the House, working with, in this case, an opposition, in 97, an opposition president. And they stuck with it on principle. Basically, the pay-go principle is what was behind it. My participation in that, in the 90 Act, led Republican leader Bob Michael to appoint me as the second-ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, which I held for 4 years, and actually was going to run for chairman. I didn't make it, but John Kasich did, whom you may remember. But I backed him up, and we in those days, we didn't just sit around and vote no. We offered alternative budgets to the total majority. Then the Democrats were back in control. But we would offer a total alternative budget, program by program, and then take it to the floor and offer it on the floor. You don't see that anymore. And it wasn't done in an acrid atmosphere. It was done in a constructive atmosphere. And I think it helped produce good results. Some of us even joined forces with the so-called blue dog Democrats that have gotten fewer and fewer all the time, but they're still there. And we would offer things in line with the Budget Committee's approach to appropriations bills on the floor or amendments that are not in sync with the budget. And so we would get up there and offer alternatives. It's unheard of. I didn't have many appropriations in my district, so it was a free ride for me. But, and that's an example of people willing to stick their necks out for important financial principle. The second thing I'm going to mention briefly, I would say that worked, and I think that's a model that we can still follow, even at this stage of the game. You've got people who've been involved in it on the two commissions who are going to be looking at solutions to the problem. The president signed an extension of PAYGO as late as February the 14th, a month ago, for 5 more years in principle. We broke it 2 weeks later with this special supplement for unemployment compensation. But I mean, the budget ought to have a contingency fund in there for short-term things that can't be anticipated, so we don't violate our own principles every time we turn around. Stick with them. We'll get somewhere with it. The other thing I wanted to mention, because it does cover entitlements, you may remember this name, but in 1993, we had had a long succession of the things that Bob was talking about, and that is the buildup of obligations under the Social Security Fund. They were supposedly operating on a PAYGO basis. That is to say, they were getting more tax revenue on Social Security than they had to lay out, but that's now reaching a point where it's going to reverse itself. And they talk about the Social Security Trust Fund. There ain't anything in the trust fund but government IOUs, so when those IOUs are so-called cashed, the government's got to go out and borrow externally to pay for it. There are no reserves there. And that's what I mean by unfunded liabilities. I'm going to have to wind up here. I'm getting the clock called on me. But let me just mention the difference in the conclusion of that. This is the most bipartisan commission that was ever put together. We had a Republican president. We had 2 senators, chairs of the committee, one Democrat and one Republican, Bob Kerrey and Danforth. Then we had the administration appointed 10 members, half Democrats and half Republicans, from the public at large or the administration. The senators were divided 6 and 6, either side, the House the same way. We came up with 100 ways to bring the entitlement programs into balance and included them in a sort of a composite recommendation made by the 2 chairmen. But the committee wouldn't vote for a single recommendation. So the president stuck with no recommendation. Consequences, the most bipartisan commission did not have the leadership of a president forcing the issue. So the final thing I want to leave with everyone, number one is the importance of reestablishing PAYGO as something that we can debate around, but at the end of the day we have to come to a final conclusion. And number 2, to get the president on board with it. This president has shown he can wrap some knuckles and get things done, and that's what we're going to have to do to solve this budget problem. And if we don't get it done this year, it's going to be another 4 years probably before anything's done with it. But I thank you for your indulgence and appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Phil. Great to be back at the University of North Carolina. Wonderful place and wonderful weather. I'm grateful to Congressman McMillan for mentioning or really lauding the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990 because I think it was extremely important, and its lapsing is part of why we are where we are today. We used those rules, and when I say use, we, I mean the budget folks in the Clinton administration. I have sat in the Oval Office and said to the president, that's a great idea, Mr. President, but we can't do it. We can't pay for it. We need to be able to say that again. Bob Bixby has described the current budget situation looking forward as unsustainable. That's absolutely right. What does that mean? It means we can't borrow all that money. Not just it's undesirable, we probably can't borrow as much money as we would need to sustain current policy for many years into the future. Because that line, that spending line, is rising faster than the economy is growing, driven by Medicare and Medicaid, and to a lesser extent, Social Security. Spending growing faster than the economy is growing is a recipe for disaster, because at any level of taxation, the revenue grows about as fast as the economy does. So if the spending's growing faster and the revenue isn't, you've got a widening wedge. Now, the consequences of trying to borrow that much, not saying we will, but even trying to, are going to be inevitably, eventually, much higher interest rates, which not only raises the cost of carrying the debt to the government, it's bad for all of us. It means higher mortgage rates, higher car payments, higher everything, and a much less favorable climate for business investment. And that means a slower growth economy. Higher interest rates, probably a fall in the dollar, possibly inflation, although I'm less worried about inflation than a spike in interest rates causing a new depression. But whatever it is, it's not good. Now, the important thing about these facts is they're not new. The situation that I just described, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security driving spending up and revenues not rising as fast, is a speech I could have made, and in fact did make, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. We knew this was coming. It has not been a secret. The beneficiaries of those programs and the rules that govern the spending have been in place for a very long time. What's changed with the recession? A lot. Not the long-run budget future, which hasn't changed really at all. What has changed is that because of the financial crisis and the recession it produced, and the response of the Congress and the Federal Reserve and the administration to this catastrophe, we have added enormously not only to the near-term deficits, but to the debt. And if we'd been having this conversation even 2 years ago, I would have said we have this looming problem out here of the spending rising faster than the revenues, but you might have said, yeah, but it's a ways away, and our debt in relation to the size of our economy isn't particularly bad by world standards, even by our own past standards. We would have said 2 years ago, debt under 40% of GDP, not a big deal. But it has become a big deal because the borrowing that we had to do, and I believe we had to do it, to rescue the economy, has pushed our debt up very fast. So now, this year, over 60%. And as Bob's charts showed, if we go on like this, we'll have debt rising fast and the interest costs that go with it rising faster than we can pay for. And I think it's important to understand where this came from, because one sees, even out of my old organization, the CBO, projections called projections of the president's budget, and they show deficits coming down for a little while as the economy recovers, and then going back up again, and sending the debt on this unsustainable track. But that isn't actually the president's budget. That is the budget that comes from the decisions made over the years about entitlement programs and taxes that all of us made, that both parties made, and that the voters ratified. So what are we going to do? First, we need a goal. I think the best goal is stabilize the debt. We're not going to pay it off right away, if ever. We don't need to. We need to stabilize the increase in the debt. That can be done without actually getting to balance in the budget. We did that after World War II. We grew the economy faster than we grew the debt, and that means that the ratio comes down. Now, what are we going to do? We have to reduce the rate of growth of spending. Social Security is a relatively easy program to get back on track. It doesn't have to hurt anybody in the near term, but we can fix the Social Security system so that it is more fully funded. That means raising the retirement age far in the future, changing the way benefits are calculated so that people, especially upper income people, don't have their benefits rising quite as fast. Medicare and Medicaid harder. We have taken steps, I believe, in the healthcare reform to set in place methods of reducing the rate of growth in spending for healthcare, but we've got to follow up with much stronger measures and serious work to make our healthcare system much more efficient. And speaking of efficient, we need a more efficient tax system. We could, if we broadened the base of the income tax, got rid of a lot of loopholes and deductions, raise more money without raising tax rates. We could even bring them down. And we may eventually need to turn to a new kind of tax, a consumption tax. We are the only country in the world, the only advanced country, that doesn't have a general, broad-based consumption tax. So I believe we can fix this problem. It sounds sort of overwhelming when you hear about trillions of dollars and unfunded liabilities and all of that, but actually relatively small changes in the programs that are driving spending and relatively small changes in the tax system could solve this problem. We are not alone. It's not a peculiar American problem. Other countries have aging populations and rising costs of medical care. We have the capability to sit down together. As Congressman McMillan pointed out, we've done this before. We got to surplus in the 90s, but it takes talking across party lines and saying, we've got to solve this problem. Let's sit together and do it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stefan Byrd-Krueger, the Youth Outreach Coordinator of the Concord Coalition. And I have to say, it's certainly an honor to speak in series with such a distinguished panel. I don't think, we can't give enough praise to folks like Dr. Rivlin, Congressman McMillan, and of course, the man who writes my paycheck, the great Bob Bixby. I've been with Concord since 2007, since shortly after I graduated from college. And over the 3 years, I've been to a handful of panels like this, more than a couple. And I realize that it's usually about this point in the evening when people start to get a little anxious. You know, they hear all of this news about how deep in trouble our country is, and they start to wonder, I don't know if we can really get our way out of this. They start looking for the exits, checking for their passport, just in case they need to break for Canada. But it's my job to come in and tell you that it's not as hopeless as it may seem. We can affect these decisions that are driving our fiscal future. And not just as a country can we affect it. We as individuals, it is within our powers to make our voice heard and change the course of our country. Now, in particular, I'm responsible for reaching out to my own generation, the millennials, the youngest generation, the young adults in our country. And here being at a university, I don't have to tell you that much about the nature and characteristics of our generation. You already know that we are the most connected, best educated, most engaged generation ever asked to address problems like this. We, after all, are the generation that invented online social networking. We communicate faster than ever before, and we have participated, we've created movements that span not just the country, but span the entire globe. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise to you that millennials who use social networking sites report that about 91% of them report that they contribute and participate in their communities in some way, shape, or form, as opposed to 64% of those who don't use networking sites, you know, and that includes everything from donating money, giving food, volunteering, declaring membership in clubs and civic groups. But where you see it kind of peters off a little bit on the far side of the chart there is when it comes to actually engaging in policy issues. You know, our participation rates drop down to the teens when you look at attending public meetings to discuss issues or trying to change government policies. And there's probably a good chance that this is because policy seems really hard to access. You know, it happens out there in Washington. You don't really know how to influence it, and even if you do, you don't know how to measure your impact. It just seems relatively inaccessible. So, I mean, we all have this general concept of what happens in Congress. So let's take, for example, North Carolina's own Congressman Price. So he influences policy, of course. I mean, it's not quite that simple. He directs his staff, and then his staff influence policy. And through their research and the ideas they have, they help shape his idea and the policy. And it's important to note that his staff is overwhelmingly comprised of millennials, of young people. And these are people who get to contribute their ideas to the process. But even there, that's not a contained system. There's a whole class of congressional staff, the legislative correspondents, whose job it is to listen to the constituents, get their ideas, get their opinions. And so they listen to communities and businesses, all sorts of advocacy groups. But I mean, even there, I say advocacy group. That sounds like something like lobbyists. I don't really know what that is, how to access it. So let's look at a case study. The Young Invincibles Why I Want Change campaign over the past year. Now this was a coalition of youth organizations that were made and operated by college students to a large extent. Now one of their positions, they were advocating for healthcare reform. One of their positions was they wanted to get young adults covered on their parents' health plans until the age of 26. Now let's compare that goal to the bill that got signed about a week and a half ago. If you look in section 2714 in there, adult children until the child turns 26 years of age. Now that seems pretty impressive, looks good for them, and looks even better when you realize that one of the leaders of that coalition was invited by Nancy Pelosi to the signing. So this looks like young people, the millennial generation, having an influence. But even still, I mean, I don't know how to get into that coalition. What does it look like? So let's look at one of the coalition groups, the Roosevelt Institute. Roosevelt Institute is a network of chapters of students all over the country. And if you go to their website and click through, you can look at a map. They've got a map of all their chapters, and if you zoom in on that map, you can see they have a chapter right here at UNC. And if you click through that, you can see that they're here at UNC doing policy. They're writing blog posts, producing recommendations, and it's made of real people, students. These are your peers. And in fact, some of them may even be in this room right now. Do we have any Roosevelt kids out there? So there you go. Yeah. So all of a sudden, this policy, which used to seem so inaccessible, it's not just done elsewhere by other people. It's done by people who sit next to you in an audience. These are people that you know. They could be your classmate. They could be one of your students. And then you realize that the policy they're impacting is just one piece of the pie. So let's take healthcare, for example, as we've been discussing. Healthcare is a piece of the annual federal budget. And that could be healthcare, it could be Social Security, it could be defense, you name it. They all fit into that pie that determines what a country is doing. And if you compare that federal budget from one year and line it up with all the other years, you start to see, this slide's a little messed up, but you start to see that they all add up together, and they all form the charts that you were seeing with Bob before. This charts the course of our country. And if you look at the trend lines of what these policies suggest, you can see that the influence that you can have on your chapter, which influences the coalition, which influences the legislative correspondence, which influences the congressman, which helps direct the policy. You can see that you have the power to chart the future of our government. So once you see that you have that power, the question is, what's next? What's the next step? How do you start on this journey? Well, number one, we're going to have a reception just after this. There will be food. And when you're there, I don't want you to just, hang out. I want you to actually look at the people who are sitting next to you and standing next to you and talk to them about their opinions about this issue and how they want to see it addressed. And while you're here, I challenge you to schedule a time within the next week to meet up with one of those people again, have coffee, and talk more about our fiscal challenge and how you want to address it. And then beyond that, try to find a group to join. If you talk to all the ones around you and they don't really understand why, explain to them why this is important. If they have ideas about it that you don't agree with, go make your own group and invite people to join you. Organize a screening of IUSA, a wonderful documentary that explains this issue. And go on beyond that. Invite one of Concord's field staff. We've got two of them up here in the front of the room. Invite them back to organize an exercise for one of your classrooms. And then maybe you can challenge that group that you disagreed with to a debate. And you can invite the congressman to come and moderate that debate. And eventually, you'll be able to take these ideas, take the policies that you put together, and bring them back to Washington. So I encourage you to work on this. Join the Concord Coalition. Come join us in Washington. We've got an internship program, so there are opportunities for you to join us directly. But beyond that, we just want to be able to connect you with other students who are interested in this, connect you with other public policy institutions, and eventually help you connect yourself with the decision makers in Washington so you can affect our fiscal future. Thank you.
Do we have any microphones for people to talk into?
We don't.
Okay.
We can just use this one. I was thinking if they want to come up and talk, this one has to be.
I don't think. Okay. All right, so when you get it, you'll have to speak up. Yes, sir, in the back.
I think bottom line, what we're going to have a statement up there that don't worry about continuing in office. What kind of pressure or influences are we going to have to put on the House and Senate where they basically put the long-term interest of the country first and not worry about those students?
Alex, that sounds like a question for a former congressman.
I left. No, I introduced a term limit bill. It didn't go anywhere, but this would have been for House members three terms, and limited and change the terms to 4 years so they're not running for office all the time anyway. And I think that could be a constructive move. You could do the same thing in the Senate, but that didn't go to pass. That's not the solution. I think the solution lies in who you support and encourage good candidates to get involved in the process. Young candidates, people who are highly successful at what they're doing at the age of 40 to 50, who are willing to go serve in the Congress and make a little sacrifice to do so. I think that's what's needed. And you get enough of them there, then they have a larger voice than those who are hanging around, so to speak. There's some good people. They're just not in the majority at this point.
Can I add to that? Because I don't think term limits are necessarily the answer. The answer is public insistence that we have to solve this problem. Now, in 1992, one of the candidates, which you may not remember, was a man named Ross Perot. Ross Perot was a businessman with a kind of squeaky voice. He had lots of charts, and he didn't win. He didn't come close to winning, but he energized the public to take this problem seriously. And it was one of the reasons that the Clinton administration, when it came in, working with the Congress and continuing to work with the Congress, was able to get the budget into surplus. I have a prediction, may be wrong. I think this election is going to focus attention on the budget deficit. And it may not produce a solution, but it's going to get the public energized, because both parties are going to accuse the other of having caused the budget deficit and the debt increase. That's not terribly helpful, the blame game. But what I think it will accomplish is getting everybody thinking about it, and the Congress, whoever is elected, realizing they got to do something.
Stefan, did you have? I had. I mean, part of the solution, I think, is in some of these budget rules. Alex mentioned PAYGO, which I think is important. Now, budget rules are never going to solve anything, but they may help create an atmosphere, a framework in which things can get solved, and they may provide an excuse for political leaders to do the right thing. And let me use the example of PAYGO. When PAYGO works, it works not only because some of it works beneath the surface, because things don't get passed that might expand the deficit because of people like Alice Rivlin going into the president and saying, but, you know, how would you pay for it? We can't pay for it. Some of the former senators on the Concord Coalition board have told me many times that that was very helpful to them to have a PAYGO rule and a consensus that we were going to enforce it, because they would get constituents, lobbyists, interest groups coming into their office and saying that, you know, the various things, and they'd say, that's a very good idea. I'd really like, I want to be with you on this. Now, how do we pay for it? And sometimes that would prevent things from happening that would otherwise have happened to expand the deficit. Now, we got to wait, you know, the PAYGO worked very well for a number of years, and its discipline did fade when we had a budget surplus. One could argue that by that point it had served its, not it served its purpose, but it had accomplished the major goal of when it was originally enacted. So Congress has reenacted a PAYGO law. And yes, you know, we'll see how strictly it's enforced, but that's one of the types of things that can, now look, Congress passes laws and they can ignore them. I mean, they make the rules, they can change the rules. But I think, as Alice said, I think that there is going to be a lot of attention paid to this, and when the public is engaged about it, I think putting the rules in place that can help bring about decisions is going to be very important. I think the other thing, Alice is serving on a presidential commission. I think that can help too, because if you can get people to, you know, sort of challenge them to work in a small group and to make some compromises and put that before the greater body, that might work. As Alex McMillan had mentioned, there have been commissions that have succeeded in the past and commissions that have failed, but it is another one of these process devices that can help change the political dynamic. And just let me say before the next question, on the commission, I think that if the commission doesn't necessarily come up with the answer in December when they're going to report. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has been a failure. If what comes out of it are some good ideas that can be put forward in the President's budget in the coming year, it will have started a process and a discussion. So I would, add both of those as ideas for helping to break that dynamic that you mentioned and get some more long-term thinking into the budget. Yes.
All three of the speakers spoke not necessarily glowingly, but positively about the health care reform bill that is now law. And I look at 25-year-olds being able to avoid purchasing insurance on their own and putting that cost back onto their parents, and taking a look at the way that it's become affordable by pretending that Medicare cuts will actually go through, where the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Studies has already said that they're not going to impose those, an expectation that Congress is going to pass the doc fix that was taken out of the health care bill. And to me, it looks like this bill is part of the same gaming of the rules and the system and the way that we can afford things in the future. And I just want to get some comments from the speakers about how this bill actually does anything to address the federal debt besides making it worse.
Anybody want to, we all want to chime in on Alice? Do you?
What bill is he referring to?
The health care bill. Health care reform.
Let me take a start.
This may take the rest of the evening to answer this one.
You got all night. We got a long way, excuse me.
I think that some of what you say is right, that there is some optimistic scoring in the bill, and that some of the things that are made to pay for it may not happen. On the other hand, if the Congress is refocused on the importance of these kinds of things, I mean, they're essentially pay-go rules within the healthcare reform, I'm reasonably optimistic that it will be paid for. But much more important, the things that this bill puts in place, I believe, are the beginnings of what we need to do to begin making healthcare more efficient. They are only the beginnings, but we have to start looking at what works and what doesn't in healthcare. Change the reimbursement for healthcare from the federal government and from private payers to reimburse effective payments and not wasteful payments. That has to be based on research and convincing evidence, but it is necessary in a very inefficient healthcare system where we waste a lot of money on unnecessary and ineffective treatments and unnecessary testing to get a handle on this. And I think the bill is a good start on that.
Yeah.
I'll just mention one thing, because I offered the solution in 1993. I didn't get my neck cut off by it, but I thought we should fund insurance for those who couldn't pay for it, because there are a lot of good reasons to do that. It runs up cost in a number of ways. People overusing emergency rooms, and I can go on and on. And there's a matter of justice in that as well. And so I bought into that, and we actually put if you want to read it, it's still an enrolled bill in the Senate, and you can pull it out and read it. It's worked out in detail. But the interesting part of it was how we would fund it. We basically devised a plan, and one of the guys who helped me do that, sitting about 25 feet in front of me right now, we devised a plan that was checked out actuarially, and what we did was put a cap on the deductibility of insurance premiums for corporations on a per capita basis. For individuals, we would have allowed an individual full deductibility, and also on any other institutional plans, including union plans. When you did that, and you basically said, okay, if it's a right for people to have health care, it's also an obligation that people not take advantage of bloated health care plans and deduct it and let us, the taxpayers, foot the bill. That's what's been happening. So we basically put a cap on it, transferred the funds that were generated out of that, and it went to pay for health care, and it went all the way up to every individual up to in excess, up to almost 200% of poverty. It paid for the whole thing. Actuarially, it'd probably do the same thing again. And we would have allowed that then to go into the private sector to purchase private insurance policies. What we used as a standard was what then was the standard Blue Cross Blue Shield package, which I think was $3,500 for a family of 4. We had testimony from, let's say, the head of Bethlehem Steel, which by and large at that point was simply fulfilling contractual obligations. It wasn't making much steel. But I asked him, I said, what is the cost of the health care plan for your employees? I think at the time it was $12,000 per employee, so almost 4 times what a standard Blue Cross Blue Shield benefit package would be. And that's deductible. They came close to including that in this bill, but you can imagine the storm of political pressure not to do that. But I thought it was equitable, and it's been around. It could be done, still can be done. They could, I think, I don't know the ins and outs of this, but you could probably offer that as an amendment to the health care bill and under the tax legislation and do it right now.
I think that we get that question a lot at the Concord Coalition, since we focus on debt and deficits, is what effect will the health care bill have, because it's an enormous undertaking, and it has potentially very large consequences. The official scoring by the Congressional Budget Office was that it would be paid for, result in slight deficit reduction over 10 years and a larger amount over the following. And you can look at the assumptions behind that, and some of the savings do indeed seem to be ambitious. Some of the substitute that they use for the type of tax change that Alex described is what is often referred to as the Cadillac Tax, which is a tax on high insurance, high premium plans. And that a lot of us thought was an important thing to put in the bill, because it would not only raise revenues but have a positive impact of slowing the growth of healthcare. At least it would put some incentives in place to do that, as Alice mentioned. And but that having been said, it doesn't go into effect now until 2018, and so you do have to worry about some backsliding there, because there are a couple of elections that will happen between now and then. So, our position at the Concord Coalition is that we should hold everybody's feet to the fire to actually make the changes that they have, the cost control mechanisms that they have put into this bill, make sure they actually do it. We're going to have to make cuts in Medicare, and we're going to have to raise revenues regardless, whether we passed health care reform or not. One of my concerns, because of the trend lines that are already existing, so one of my concerns really is that a lot of options that could have been used for deficit reduction are used or will be used to fund the new expenditures. And even if everything works according to plan, and the budget and the plan really does reduce the deficit by the amount projected, it still leaves us on an unsustainable path. So we have a long way to go yet. I mean, nobody should think that this is, if you're a proponent of the bill, it's the answer to the charts that we're looking up there. But if you're an opponent of the bill, I'd also say one of the things that, we can't repeal the bad and keep the good. If we're going to expand coverage, we're going to have to find a way to pay for it, and hopefully the things that have been put in place they'll stick to them. Sir?
Past couple of years, I've come to start following economic ideology of 2 very outspoken proponents of this stuff. One being Congressman Ron Paul
That sounds like one for you, Alice.
Well, I mentioned that one of the possibilities, if we go on trying to borrow these large sums of money, is not only rising interest rates, maybe even a spike in interest rates that would be devastating, but a rapid fall in the dollar, which would make, we've had some fall in the dollar, and that's not all bad, but a rapid fall in the dollar would be very destabilizing. And I think those are scary possibilities and ones we have to avoid. I do not agree with Congressman Ron Paul's solution, which is go back to the gold standard. I don't, and abolish the Federal Reserve. I think both of those are not practical or helpful suggestions.
There was a congressman, his name was Bill Dannemeyer from California while I was there, and he would routinely every year offer a motion to go back on the gold standard, and it didn't pass. Nobody wanted
It's not a good idea.
Yes, sir.
The partisanship is so bad. I don't know whether the partisanship is so bad because of the health care bill, but it seems to me to get something done in the area that you were talking about, which is essential. We've got to get beyond this partisanship. Is that likely to happen, or we're not going to happen in my lifetime?
Well, let me make one observation first and turn it over to the others. You know, the Concord Coalition started in 1992, and I was with the Concord Coalition at that time, and I have noticed a marked increase in the partisanship just from that time, and I thought things were pretty partisan then. I mean, one of the radical ideas of the Concord Coalition was to be an organization that drew from both sides. We've had Democratic and Republican co-chairs ever since we were established. And in those days, people were working on balanced budget plans, and you'd have these coalitions, and Alex described it perfectly. You'd have Democrats and Republicans would form budget, come up with their own alternative budgets, and we always used to work with those folks, and there's really none of that going on now on the Hill. And there's what I worry about is that the people that knew how to do that sort of thing have all left. And I'm not talking just about the members themselves, but the staffs have become incredibly partisan. You know, Stefan mentioned the staffs being an important thing. And there's really a tribal atmosphere. I know we had a meeting one time. We had to really meet in a secret room. I mean, people had to sneak into it because there were bipartisan staff meeting, and damned if I didn't get a call from a congressional reporter the next day wanting to know if I had hosted such a meeting. Somebody leaked. And so it was like, oh, you know, they're watching. So I mean, people were really discouraged. You know, you shouldn't go to those sort of meetings. I mean, Mike, I agree with your premise. Can we solve that problem? We're going to have to. Anybody?
Well, I would agree we're going to have to. You said it would have happened in your lifetime. I couldn't see you for the light, so I'm not sure I can answer that. I think there are two currents in the country today. One tends to the extremes on both sides, and it gets echoed in the media with talk shows and one thing and another. On the other hand, I think there's a current among a lot of people that basically are saying, just what you're saying, why don't you just get on with it and solve the problem? So that doesn't attract as much media attention. Nobody goes to them because they're not shrill. That's what the media likes, you know, that wakes people up in their chairs. But somehow or another, we've got to reinforce that, and the whole country seems to be moving out on the periphery, and we ought to be moving into the center. And somehow or another, we're going to have to give a greater voice to that. So that's going to be up to people like you that think that's important.
I agree with that, but one encouraging thing is what's been learned from some of the public engagement activities. When you get a group of average citizens in a room and say, here's the problem, and some of them are Republicans and Democrats and some of them are conservatives and liberals, here's the problem, and here are some possible solutions. Now try to figure it out. They can do it. They can do it in a compromise way and come up with a practical set of solutions. They're way ahead of the politicians.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that, and I think you're absolutely right. Partisanship is put a stranglehold on Washington, and we need to find a way around it. And I think a big part of the way to fix it is by having the nonpartisans make more noise. I mean, right now, partisan people tend to be angry, and angry people yell, and so you hear them more. And so if the nonpartisan people who are looking more towards the future and looking for solutions started yelling, then maybe the nonpartisanship could actually win out and be heard by the media, and then the media would start following that story. And so to that end, I mean, it means that, you know, if you are happy about things or if you want things to move in a different direction, then you should call your congressperson. Get involved in a grassroots way, just like you do with anything else, and let them know. Let them know your constructive feedback and not just the angry partisan feedback. You know, it's a friend of mine works on the Hill, and all they get all day long are phone calls from people who are screaming at them, calling them dirty names. But if they started getting just as many calls from people like most of you in this room, I'm sure, who have constructive feedback, then that would help them get out of that sort of I am in a war mentality, help them realize that they have allies in the public and that they can make the hard choices without getting in trouble for it.
Yeah, one of the process changes, we're going to wrap up here in a second, but I wanted to mention that another thing that people talk about is redistricting reform. Some of the congressional districts now are, you know, written in such a way the majority gets in, and so it's, you know, you have congressional districts that are almost written to protect partisan fiefdoms, and so there are a diminishing number of congressional districts that are competitive where people have to listen to both sides, and that may be playing a part as well. Let me also mention, I think Sarah may be passing around, for those of you that want to follow Stefan's advice, we do have a sign-up sheet, or that just want some information from the Concord Coalition or others to get on our email list. We have a sign-up sheet for that. Phil, where is Phil? Do we have time for another question, or what are we going to do here? We're going to wrap up. Okay. All right. Well, we have a reception right across the hall, so the conversation can continue. And Stefan has told you that you all have to be engaged in this, and we will all be over there. So thank you very much for coming, and we hope that this will continue here at the university.